welcome. Logos and Markets. This is Drew Blazsik here, and I am excited to have Dr. Michael King, who is an associate professor chair of the School of Business at Benedictine College. Dr. King brings a diverse and distinguished background in law, business, and public service. He holds a Juris Doctor from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, an MBA from the Thunderberg School of Global Management, a Master's of Science from Fort Hays State University, and a BA from Benedictine College. He served as president of the College of Saints John Fisher and Thomas More in Fort Worth, Texas. His professional experience spans entrepreneurship, investment banking, and public policy, having worked as a principal in several startup ventures and as a professional staff for the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee. So it's it's an honor to have you on here, and I'm excited. And in this talk, we're going to talk about money, the definition of money, and the role of money. So welcome.
Thank you, Drew. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm honored that you asked me to be on your show. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I know when I interviewed Brian McCall, he said you got to speak with Michael King, and I was like, you know what, let's do it. And he said you have a great class on money, and I wish at my school when I first took I went for economics and finance. They have some money in banking, but it's not the history of it, and it's always like the math behind it. And I think people want to learn the history behind that stuff.
Yeah, well, I appreciate Brian saying that, and it's a very popular class. It's a fun class to teach, and just so your listeners or viewers don't worry, we also do give the students classes on the traditional money in banking. But my class is definitely not that. It's on the history, nature of money, and then the evolution of things like banking that flows from that. So,
I'll just say that is actually a very exciting topic, and I don't think people really understand how exciting. I mean, there's actually a podcast out there called the What is Money podcast, and it's actually kind of entertaining on that. So, hey, let's start with this. I always like to ask people this question. How would you, I mean, we know the three characteristics of money, but how would you define money? If you had to define it in your own aspect, not the textbook, what they say, but how would you define it?
Well, my definition of money would include those three functions that you just mentioned. I would say money is an economic good that serves as the medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value in the economy. And, for any of your viewers who have studied logic, they would remember this, we can categorize definitions several different ways, but the most essential definition you can come up with, an important term, would be that which gives its general status. So that would be it's an economic good, and then that which is makes it specifically different from the other economic goods, and that is, as you mentioned, those are the three functions of money: the medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value.
Now, would you say is our current U.S. dollar, does it meet those criteria in your opinion?
No, it doesn't. In fact, I every year in my class, on the first day of class, I give the students a little test. It's a verbal test, and I tell them, okay, let's imagine that there are two boxes up here in the front of the class, and in box A you have $100,000 in U.S. dollars, U.S. Federal Reserve notes, in freshly printed, crisp $100 bills. You've got $100,000 worth in that box. In box B, you've got $100,000 worth of gold coins. And, I usually update it with what the price of gold is on that day. And right now, gold's like, what, $3,400 almost. But I'll say, let's just to make it easy, let's say, gold is worth $2,000 an ounce. So you have 50 1-ounce gold coins in box B. All right, now you get to choose. So in other words, the purchasing power of each box is the same, $100,000. So you get to choose. Now, let's put some conditions on it. The first condition is you have to spend the contents of the box you choose. You have to spend it within 24 hours or you lose it. Which box would you choose? And you can imagine they all choose box A. They all choose the Federal Reserve notes, US dollar, because they're spending it. They have to spend it right away. And then I say, all right, the next condition is whatever box you choose, you cannot spend the contents for 10 years. Which box do you choose? And they all, without exception, choose the box of the gold coins. Then I say, all right, now let's remove all the conditions. Now you get to choose either box. But what's helpful is that, I've already, by asking the questions in that order, it gets them to start obviously distinguishing between the differences between the contents of the two boxes. And what's interesting is that when you remove all the conditions, every year, much more than half, sometimes all, but just a few students will choose box B with the gold coins in it. And what I tell them, and as you would, I'm sure, know in your classes as well, is intuitively the students have just um, demonstrated that they know the difference between a medium of exchange and a store of value, right? When the condition of the choice was you have to use it as a medium of exchange, they chose the US dollars. When the condition was strictly it has to be a store of value, they choose the gold. And then when you lift the conditions, they still would prefer the gold. And I tell them, you intuitively, the difference between a medium of exchange and a store of value, but ideally money should serve both purposes, shouldn't it? And that sort of proves that the money that we currently have does not satisfy the condition that it's a store of value. And people know that, and they know that intuitively. It loses value over time. It loses purchasing power over time. We've come to almost accept that as a given fact of nature, when in fact it's not. It's not the natural function of money. At least it shouldn't be. So I would say that the current system we have right now fails um, to satisfy the definition of money.
Yeah, I would say, I like looking at different definitions. I always look at that it represents almost human energy. It represents labor. When you see a $20 bill, you should think about what that would have taken for someone to earn it. And I think in our current system, as it devalues over time, what our grandparents have done, what our past a decade ago has devalued their labor. And I think that's injustice in that regard. I like this too. So this is from the 4th century BC. Aristotle is quoted in this paper. When he defined money as an abstract legal power, a fiat of the law, summed up in this phrase: money exists not by nature, but by law. Would you agree with that?
In part, um, I do think that money emerges naturally in an economy, in a society. And the reason for that is because the division of labor occurs naturally because of the benefits. And once you have the division of labor, that that necessitates exchange. Like if once you and I start dividing up the labor, we have to exchange your surplus for my surplus because I need some of the things that I'm not producing any longer that you are. So exchange becomes necessary. Once exchange becomes necessary, the direct exchange meets quickly certain problems because direct exchange. If I am producing eggs and I want shoes, I have to find someone who produces shoes that wants eggs. So quickly will naturally lead to indirect exchange, and indirect exchange will naturally produce a money. So now I think eventually, once you enter with a state power or a sovereign power, the sovereign can move in and then declare a certain money as the legal tender, or the sovereign power can take certain actions to stabilize or perfect the money that's circulating, but left to its own devices, society will produce money. So I think it's both natural and eventually a function of state decree. So
Very good. Next, what we got question is, could you walk us through the main theories of money?
yeah, no, that's interesting, and that actually maybe help explain a little bit what Aristotle was thinking. So in general, at least as I see it and as I teach it, um, the theories on the origin of money can be reduced to three main theories. The first one is what's known as the commodity theory of money, and that is, as I just described, money originates as a commodity, as a good in the economy. But because of the problems with direct exchange, one of the goods in the economy will eventually emerge as the medium of exchange that can. Carl Menger, in his famous paper on the nature and origin of money, he called it the most saleable commodity. So the most saleable commodity will eventually take on a new role as not just a good or a commodity in the economy, but as the medium of exchange. So that's the commodity theory. The state theory of money is what you mentioned by reading from Aristotle. That's from above, the state or the sovereign power, whether it's the prince or the government of some sort, uh, imposes by decree the medium of exchange on the society in which it governs. And the third theory of money, and by the way, Menger mentions in his paper on which is still considered sort of the great paper describing the commodity theory of money, sort of concisely. It's a very good paper. Your viewers can find it online. Carl Menger, in his paper, he mentions that for throughout most of history, and this includes going back to the Greeks, Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, they just assumed that money originated from state decree, that it wasn't a natural. And so he's referring to Aristotle's claim that it wasn't natural to society, but it was an invention or convention of man. So the state theory is the top down. Now the third theory is unique, although it has some similarities to the state theory, but it's because it's also imposed. And that is that money originates from credit. All right. And the state theory or the credit theory would, and by the way, the most prominent proponent of the credit theory as the origin of money today is the very prolific economic writer Michael Hudson. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And, credit theory says money originated in antiquity when temples or palaces or the central place of power and authority in a society and therefore in the economy, and that it issued loans or credit to people by way of food and other things. And that the tokens that were used to represent what the borrower owed started circulating as money. They circulated as an IOU, more or less. That token had value because someone had promised to pay something because of that token. So that money began as debt. And the credit theory advocates sort of mock the commodity theory by saying there's no historical record ever of the commodity theory of money ever being generated naturally through a society. And it stands to reason, as they say, that if you go to market with your eggs and you need shoes, and you're not gonna look for another commodity that you can exchange your eggs for and then go take to the shoe guy to get your shoes. You're just going to go to the shoe guy. He's going to issue you your shoes that you need and take an IOU from you. All right. Now, this begs a lot of questions. But the IOU is based on what? I mean, what do you owe him? You owe him a pair of shoes, or do you owe him some other value that equals the pair of shoes? Because if it's some other value that equals a pair of shoes, that implies that there's a money that already exists. So those are the three theories: commodity theory, state theory, and credit theory for the
And
origin.
if you had to pick one, which one would you go with?
Well, I think it's probably likely, if not, certain that money has appeared as a result of all three. I mean, there's no doubt that a sovereign power can impose money from above anytime it wishes, and the subjects of that power will comply with it. And it stands to reason that credit money, even the free money schools will say credit money can emerge naturally in any society, just in the same way that commodity money does. But um, I think the most likely explanation, and probably the most natural one, is the commodity theory. Because, there's a famous case study on this. I don't know if you've read this, Drew, but the famous paper written by a an English economist that was a prisoner of war in the Second World War, and his name is Richard Radford. And he wrote a paper on his observations in the POW camp in Germany. So he's an English soldier, he's an officer, which is important because the officer camps were run differently than the camps for the regular soldiers. So he's captured by the Germans. He is sent to a POW camp. I think in one of his transfer stations, there are 50,000 prisoners in this camp. And they divide them up by nation. So you've got the British, the Americans, the French, and so on, the Russians. They're all divided into their own separate parts. So it's almost like an international economy. And now there's no labor. They don't actually have to expend their labor to produce goods, but goods appear through the Red Cross and through other packages. So what happens naturally? Well, now the prisoners all have goods. The French have probably an excess of chocolate and coffee. The British have an excess of butter and jelly. The Americans. And so they all start trading with each other, both within their barracks and with the barracks of the other national soldiers, prisoners. So what emerges? Money. A medium of exchange emerges, and it's cigarettes, because it satisfies Carl Menger's condition that it's the most saleable commodity will be that which naturally emerges as money. And in the prison of war camp, the most saleable commodity is cigarettes, and everybody would take cigarettes. And so it's a fascinating paper, and I would encourage any of your viewers that want to read up on that. It's called The Economics of a POW Camp by an economist. The author's name is Radford. And it's really a brilliant case study on how natural money emerges in an economy like that. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. And money could, yeah, like you said, money could take a many different forms of how it's all about. It's really about goods, and we're trading, and money has to be that medium of exchange that we can easily trade my labor, your labor, for goods. Now, one thing I was kind of like dwelling on, thinking about, because a lot of people are bringing up, well, is gold money, is Bitcoin money, the U.S. dollar. Here's one thing to think about is if we don't have stable prices, and if you take gold, Bitcoin, or the US dollar, it is not stable, because like you said, what was gold? It was 1,700 an ounce not too long ago. I remember when it went down. Now it's at 3,300. So
mm-hmm.
that's according to the dollar. So you really have to compare what is the gold purchasing. But if you think about, and this is what that paper brings up, is that money should not be in an investment, right? Investment and money should be two different things, because if it's an investment and you think it's going to appreciate, what's going to happen is people are going to hoard. They're going to
Mm-hmm.
hoard money because they believe it's going to be worth more tomorrow. Now, here's the other one is if it's going to depreciate, what does that naturally create? It creates debt because you want to purchase it today before you have the money. So I think if you have something that depreciates or appreciates, it's going to cause issues in the economy. And I think the goal is you want something that is stable. That is, I could buy a home, a 2,700 square foot home, the same amount this year that I can, let's say 20 years from now, unless, and this is important, unless technology increases, becomes cheaper to make a home, or there's the technological advancement, the new homes are better, right? But the home that you purchase should cost the same. And I think that's really important that we cannot have money appreciate or depreciate because you're either going to get hoarding, which is very bad. And people did that with gold, right? If you
Mhm.
hoard gold, there's no transactions happening. And then, and Bitcoin's the same way. People say, "Oh, Bitcoin's money." Why would you want to trade Bitcoin when you think it's going to be 200,000 in Bitcoin next year? Like, I would never, you want to hold on to it.
Yeah.
So my
Yeah, it's
thought,
interesting.
and real quick, just get this. I'm gonna forget this thought real quick. Is that my thought? Is that the only way for that to happen is if money's legal, because then Congress, the government would have the power to do that. And the problem I view with gold does not grow at the rate of production. It's a little less, which means it's going to appreciate naturally. And I think that could be a problem.
Yeah, that summarizes one of the main arguments against using a commodity as money, in that its quantity would not increase as fast as the economy grows, and therefore money prices would go down. Purchasing power of money would go up. But I think it's a question of, and I think as Catholics we should always be looking for the natural. What is what is the nature of this process? Is it built into nature that money should either remain stable over time or actually increase in purchasing power, uh, despite the fact that monetary prices go down, and therefore that's called deflation. And it's one thing that most economists agree on, is that deflation is bad. Inflation is much better than deflation because of what you just said, because of the hoarding problem. But I think it's an open question. What is the natural state of things? And all the theories, and I know we're going to get into some of these here in a little bit. All these proposals for how should the monetary order be fashioned in a society, in a just, good society. All of the proposals, many of them come down to this difficult problem of gauging what is the proper rate of expansion of the money supply. How much should we be injecting new money into the system to achieve what you just laid out? Either total price stability as close as possible to the money supply increasing at the same rate as goods and services increase, and therefore prices will remain the same. How do we reach that point? So it's a big question, and obviously policymakers have been grappling with it for
And
forever.
And one thing I think we have to clear up so listeners understand is that when you brought up deflation, is that the definition of inflation, deflation forever had to do with the increase in the money supply or the decrease in the
Yeah,
money supply. And we cannot get confused with the decrease of prices or an
yeah.
increase in prices, because if it was a stable monetary system, if a prices went up, that could be a natural some shock that happened to it. Now, this is what a lot of people I think get confused is that naturally prices should go down because human ingenuity should create a new technology that creates it more efficient, quicker, and prices will drop. Like refrigeration, 1920s, only the rich had it. Now everyone has it.
Yeah.
That should be a natural thing in that aspect. But the inflation, deflation can happen from hoarding and it could happen from too much money printing. And I think that's a important
Yeah,
thing for people to understand.
Yeah, that's very good, and I agree 100%. And that is an important distinction. Most people associate the words inflation and deflation with prices, but really the change in prices is a result of inflation and deflation. Inflation being the increase in the money supply, and the deflation being the decrease in it. But a question. I don't know if you're familiar with the book. It's a great book written by Dr. Guido Hulsmann, who's a professor, an economist in France. But he's written a book called The Ethics of Money Production. And it's one of the books, along with Brian McCall's, that I use in my class. But one of the things that Hulsmann says in this book, and by the way, the book is excellent, is he defines natural money. That natural money is that money in which the supply of money increases at a natural rate, and that uh, unnatural money or artificial money is that which increases at a rate beyond what it would increase at naturally in the economy. Of course, that is a libertarian or an Austrian school position on money that just left alone, the free market would produce a money, and it would grow at the natural rate, and that would take care of prices in and of itself. I mean, there might be some small fluctuations as the economy evens out, but for the most part, the natural supply of money would remain at the same level as the natural production of goods and services, or as you said, trail it somewhat, and therefore natural money would be money that's in purchasing power increased maybe very slowly, gradually over time, which is the opposite of what we have now.
Yeah, and what we have now is something that promotes debt, and it's not by accident why credit card debt, uh, federal debt, state. I mean, it's an explosion of debt. That's just how the system is set up. And people, I think the biggest mistake, and we can get to that later on, is that they think that we could have a balanced budget, but the system almost in a way promotes that we must increase that at an increasing rate, and they keep on printing. I
Yeah.
think a balanced budget is impossible because debt money is created through debt and it originates from the federal government because commercial, and we can get into that, commercial banks must purchase the debt. So it's
Mm-hmm.
all connected. And I think
Yeah.
and people who know me know that I hate this system that we're in. And I think it creates a lot of vices. And I think
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just
I
not,
hate it too. I'm with you 100% on that, and that's why Hulsman deals with this. He's got one chapter in his book, Dr. Hulsman, on the what's he call it, the moral and spiritual legacy of fiat inflation. And so he deals with all those things that you just alluded to, by all the evils that come from this. Yeah, there is no way we could ever get to, the ideal of a balanced budget or a cap on the federal debt ceiling. There's no way any of those things can happen until the monetary system is reformed. Because
yeah.
under the current monetary system, as you said, it it is necessary that for the money supply to increase, that people go into debt. The debt has to increase, and the quickest way to increase the debt is for the government to run a deficit, right? And then the
Yeah.
banks to create the money to fund the deficit, and then and that filters down, and now we're all borrowing to buy cars and homes and to get to go to college and whatnot. So it's feeding this beast, right? This debt devouring beast. And there's no way we can reform that part until the monetary system is reformed.
I was at a dinner and they had a bunch of Senate candidates a few years back. And I was talking to a bunch of politicians and I was like, look, you guys got to understand. And it was like I was like a light bulb, like I knew something they didn't. I was like, you got to reform the monetary system before anything. Like every Republican who went up there was talking about a balanced budget. They're spending too much. And then, when they get into power, they still spend. And so it's like the drug dealer is the Federal Reserve, the monetary system, and then Congress is the one who's hooked on drugs. And the only way to get away from that is you got to take care of the drug dealer, and you have to reform it. And so I walked up to one of the Senate candidates, and I said, I don't want to say his name, but I said, and I it's brought up my point. I did it really brief, and his argument back at me, he goes, "I'm a trained monetarist." I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "We need the Fed." That's all he said, and he tried to end it real quick. And I'm like, "Come
Yeah,
on!" He didn't listen to a word I said
yeah,
about, the Fed is they promote debt and they need debt, and that's how it's created. And then you want to think about who does it benefit? It benefits the one who controls the money supply, which is the banks and the
yeah.
ones who issue it. That kind of goes into if you want to do a brief explanation of the origin and nature of monetary institutions.
Yeah, okay. So, well, of course, the main monetary institution is a bank, right? And if the viewers could follow along then back from the beginning. So if there's a natural progression of through the benefits of the division of labor to the benefits of exchange to the benefit of a medium of exchange to the emergence of something, whether regardless of what theory you hold as to the origin of money, we have a medium of exchange now, and what will come naturally from that is or are institutions that um, deal in this medium of exchange, this money. Uh, so there's theories of the on the origin of banking, and not only that, but on the role that banking plays in the economy. All right, and some of these histories are very good. We and you can walk through these through just reasoning them. The first banks that would appear would be those that would take people's money on deposit and keep it in, put it into safekeeping for them. We would call those deposit banks. And then there would be banks that would emerge that would take people's surplus money that maybe would be deposited with them and then loan them out. All right, and those would be loan banks. And then you'd have banks which quickly emerged, which would realize that if I can loan out money, the depositors don't come back to collect their deposits near as fast as I can loan it out and get it back from the borrower. So the banks start loaning out more money than they had on deposit. And what they're doing basically at that point is creating new money. Um, in most cases, new money out of nothing. So uh, the one of the real interesting books that was written on the origin of banking is written in the early 1800s, a guy named Hildreth, but he traced the origin of banking back to the city-state of Venice in what is now Italy. All right, and he said that, and I think he must have been British because I think he's British. In typical British subtle humor, he says, "So the wealthy merchants of Venice are obliged to loan money to the prince, to the sovereign power, to the government, and so they give loans to the prince to use it to go off and fight wars, or whatever. Well, the wealthy merchants that have the money that's loaned to the prince have to be paid back. So they set up a chamber called the Chamber of Loans. And the Chamber of Loans acts as the intermediary between the government that has borrowed the money and the lenders that need to get repaid. So the Chamber of Loans is the intermediary. As the funds come in that the government uses to pay back the loans with interest, it goes first through the chamber. So it's just an entity. Well, the chamber quickly, according to this author, starts acting out the three functions of banks, what are still the three functions of banks today. First of all, it always has a surplus of money. So it quickly starts saying, well, if we got all this money sitting around, we might as well use it usefully. So they start, writing bills of exchange and loaning it out at interest on short-term loans. And so loan banking develops very quickly. Also, local merchants realize that this chamber is a place where they can have their own money stored safely. So now the bank starts functioning as a depository institution. And then, as the guy says very quickly, the banks, the chamber realizes that it can loan out more than it has on deposit. And so it started actually creating its own money. It starts creating credit, credit money, more or less, or paper money. So very interesting, though, that that would be formed by the government having to, borrow money from the wealthy merchants and thereby setting up the entity as an intermediary, which eventually emerges as banks. Some of the other stories, historical stories, will say, when because in the commodity theory of money, the commodity that naturally emerges as money because it's best suited for that are the precious metals. So gold, silver, copper, uh, the three main ones. And, they emerge as money not because of some fetish for gold or silver, but because that's the commodity that's best suited to be money because of all of its characteristics. It's uniform, it's divisible, it's storable, it's durable, it can be transported easily over space and time and whatnot. So as gold and silver emerge as money, then people who want to preserve their money or aren't spending it, they want to put it somewhere safely. So the goldsmiths and the silversmiths became the first bankers because people would deposit their money with them and say, hey, can you hold on to this and I'll come back and get it when I need it. And so they became banks, and they, just like the Chamber of Loans on the city of Venice back in the 13th century, that those goldsmiths quickly started acting like bankers instead of goldsmiths. They started using the money to loan out, not just to hold it on deposit, but to loan out. And then eventually they started printing their own receipts for money that they didn't actually have in deposit. And that started circulating as paper money. So now, one thing that's interesting too, Drew, and I know you know this, but throughout the history of banking, once banking became established in the form that it is now today, the economic textbooks, it's interesting to follow them how they deal with banks throughout history. This is modern history now. So now we have banks, right? We have banks that we think of as depository institution, as lender, of those deposits and whatnot. So what are the three theories of the role that banks play in the economy? Well, the first theory is the intermediation theory, that banks are simply intermediaries. You deposit your money in a bank, your bank loans your money to me. I pay interest on the money, the bank gets the money back, the bank is preserving your deposit. The bank is simply acting as an intermediary. The second theory of banking is the fractional reserve theory, which is that, to have a fractional reserve banking system, there needs to be really a central bank. But that what banks do in the fractional reserve theory is that they loan from their bank reserves. And, through regulation, they're allowed to maybe loan more. So, let's say in the 20% fractional reserve banking regulation that banks can loan out, they have to keep, they have 20% of the total loans that they've loaned out, they have to have in reserve in the form of real money on their balance sheet. And then the third theory of banking is the credit creation theory. And that is the theory that banks simply, when they make a loan, create the money. So it's credit, loan, creation. Money is created by the loan. And these three theories have been dealt with in all the economic textbooks. And, it'd be interesting, I'd be interested to know your experience with this, because occasionally in my office, we'll have bankers in there. They might be the father of one of our students, and he's there to visit, and he comes by to chat, and we start talking. And it's clear that, and I also talk to some friends, some of whom are brilliant, like Ivy League educated guys. And many of these people think today that banks operate as intermediaries, that they just simply take deposits and loan them out. And they don't realize, even some of them who are running banks, that that's not how it works. The banks, when a loan is created, the banks create the money. So all three of those theories have held sway over time: credit creation, fractional reserve, simple intermediation. But what's really the status of banks is that they're credit money creators, and have been really since at least since 1913, and total credit money creators since 1971. So, but those are generally considered the three theories on the function of banking in the economy.
Yeah, it's like a very simple way of looking at it is someone deposited, let's say $100 worth of gold. And what they did back then, they would create those papers saying, hey, you have a right to that gold sitting there. And then the banks go,
Mhm.
you know what? No one's grabbing their gold. We're going to give this to 10 different people. And then everyone has that right to that same gold and it's trading. And then, but the
Yeah,
problem is if they say, you know what, I want my gold, the next person says, I want my gold, there's no more gold in there. And then that's where
yeah,
you have a bank run. And that's when you have those bank collapses like
yeah, yeah.
Silicon Valley.
The two problems the banks had to get around was the charge of fraud. If they if they if they have more claims on the gold in deposit than they do gold, that's fraud,
Yep.
uh, and that creates a problem if they run up against it, and that's what you were describing. The other problem the early banks had was the charge of embezzlement. If you deposit your money in a bank, gold, you deposit your gold and silver coins in a bank for safekeeping, and the bank now, even without fractional reserve lending, if the bank loaned those coins out to a borrower without your express permission, that's embezzlement, right? They're taking an asset that's not theirs, that they're given a custody of for safekeeping, and they're using it for their own benefit without you agreeing to it. That's embezzlement. So these early banks had, problem that the temptation to use the money that's on deposit and to benefit from it was great. I'm sure you can imagine the temptation was great. Let's loan this out, even without creating fake receipts. If they loaned it out, it would be embezzlement. But if they
I don't
create fake receipts, now they got two problems. Now they're not only embezzling people's deposits, they're they're engaged in fraud because they're creating more claimed receipts on the gold than actually exists.
I don't think good things happened to the bankers when people found out back then that they lend out all their gold and they don't have any gold at the bank.
Yeah,
But what they did was very smart, right? They got together and they legalized that system, what we have today, right? They
yeah,
made it a legal aspect to it. And then you brought up reserves that they have to hold on. It's like holding on to a certain percent of the gold. But as far as I know, ever since COVID, they eliminated that, and right now it's 0%. And just want to bring this up so people understand. People think that banks, like you said, you have to have a deposit. No, that's not how it works. And then people think, well, what if it's a reserve of 10%? It limits them. But people, and Michael Kumoff talks about this really good in his work when he talks about the Chicago plan. Banks lend out unlimited when they believe you can pay it back. So they look at the economy. If the economy is doing good, they're lending out everything to everybody. And they don't really worry about how many reserves because they'll get that later on. They just want to lend out, make that profit. So what happens is you have these booms because now everyone's getting cheap money and they believe people are going to pay it back. But the opposite happens that when it's a downturn, they know that people got laid off. There's a good chance you won't be able to pay it back. Therefore, they limit cash and becomes a liquidity problem. And I think, and that becomes the bust. So the whole system really exaggerates and it really pushes in both directions the booms and the busts that Michael Kumoff, what he said, we would, if we had a 100% reserve system, we would never have had those big recessions and booms.
Yes, and of course he's correct. But the banks, I mean, imagine the discipline that's necessary for banks to engage in 100% reserve requirement. You know, that's what eventually happened. Is that they colluded, they formed cartels, and they said, all right, we all have to. It benefits all the banks for all of us to keep at least some reserve requirements. So you know, let's set it at. I think historically the initial requirement was like 20, and it went down to 10, and then in the U.S. it went to 5, and then as you said, they eliminated it entirely during COVID. But that sort of put a lie to the whole thing. It wasn't really a fractional reserve system at all. It was a credit creation system all along. They were just creating the money that they were loaning out at interest.
Yeah, and so people understand is that when you raise that interest rate, that means it for businesses it becomes more of you have to make more of a profit to make up that cost. So then the lending could decrease. So if you lower the interest rate, people of course borrow more money creation. But yeah, so that is really interesting
You
about
know,
the
it's
history.
another one of the interesting things to think about is so, you know, one of the questions that really fascinating, how did we get to the paper money that we have now? Okay. And again, regardless of whether you think money originated as a commodity or as a state by state fiat or by an IOU, you know, credit, you know, there's no denying the fact that at one point in Western civilization, at least, money was a commodity. It was gold, silver, copper. Okay, and then there were lots of surrogates, and banks were still loaning out more than they had on deposit. But the money was always a real thing, a commodity. So how did we get to where we are now, where money is just simply paper and fiat money, meaning the fiat means it's declared as money by declaration. So be it. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. And really, the first step in that process. So think about this. The first step in that process of going from real money to the paper money that we have was the banks were first falsifying certificates. They were issuing a certificate for a claim of the real money. And those certificates, those claims were in excess of the real money that they had. So those documents were false. They were falsified documents. And in order to get to where we are today, the first step had to be to legalize that falsification. I mean, think of that from a moral or ethical perspective. You know, we talk about the fruit of the poison, the fruit of the poison tree. Uh, the first step in getting to the money system we have now was legalizing a falsification. It's
Yeah,
it's
that's pretty funny. Oh, maybe not funny, but you know what's interesting about that? I did a whole. I don't have my presentation with me. I should have looked it up before this. But the first ever fiat currency, 100% fiat, was in Massachusetts, and it had to do with. I'm trying to think. There was some battle with the French. I don't remember exactly where it was, but they said, "How are we going to get these people to still fight? We don't have enough money." And that's when they did the printing press and they start giving
yeah.
them the certificates. And they were hoping if they won, they have some riches from that, and they could pay their soldiers. But I believe they lost, and then mutiny kind of grew.
Yeah.
And that was the first known case. And what's really interesting, think about it, they're giving you this piece of paper that really means nothing at the time because money was always gold and silver. And what makes it valuable is that the government says you have to pay taxes.
Yeah.
Therefore, this is the only thing we're going to accept. So, therefore, you must work a certain period of time to earn that so you don't, so you can pay your taxes.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole story, I wish I had my notes here, but the Massachusetts, and there's a big debate on that. Some people hated that. But and also what's interesting during the revolution, or the what England did was they got our currency and they started to print more, and they caused massive inflation during the
Yeah.
Revolutionary War, and
Mhm.
which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty limiting condition of state imposed fiat currency. And that is for its success, it relies on state coercion. And in many cases against the wishes of the people. Like in my poll to the students, the state could come in and say, you can't choose the box that has the gold coins in it. You can only choose the box that has the Federal Reserve notes in it. Well, so that system relies on state coercion, which is problematic in and of itself. But yeah,
I
all the
looked it up.
experiments with paper money prior to the one that we're living under now, all the experiments historically with paper money failed.
Yeah, I forgot. There is an example a long time ago. There's some records of China doing something
Yeah,
similar. Forgot about that. And
yeah.
that
I
was
think
a while back.
some histories will credit China as being the first place where paper money emerged because they I don't
Yeah.
know, because the technology in China was advanced enough that they could
And what I
print.
was thinking, yeah, it was 1690, the continental currency from Massachusetts, which was after the in China happened. This was the first known case in as we know it today in Europe or in the
Yeah,
West.
yeah. The government in Massachusetts had a problem. They had soldiers that had come home expecting to get paid, and the colony government didn't have the money to pay them. They didn't have the
Let's
real
print it.
money, so they issued
Yeah.
them paper, which those soldiers were smart enough to know that paper didn't have any value. But and that also, Drew, it leads to another. So if we say in order to be money, it has to serve as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Well, the unit of account is coexistent with the medium of exchange. Unit of account just means prices, and we can measure economic activity based on a common measure, $1. But the store of value, I don't know if you recognize this in Brian McCall's book on usury. He begins one of his early chapters with the definition of money, and he pulls out the legal definition of money. The legal definition is simply the medium of exchange that is given legal tender status by the government. So notice that definition does not include the store of value. All right. Now, when you go back to Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, all the Catholic teaching on this, the idea that the money acts as a store of value was considered an essential function of money. And Brian in his book goes on to say, in this book, we're going to include in our definition of money its other two functions, which not just a medium of exchange, it's a unit of account and a store of value. And I think even St. Thomas, St. Thomas called money artificial wealth, and that it's an invention of man. I think he follows Aristotle in that, by the way. He said just about anything can be used as money, except that it should be that which retains its value most. So that begs the question: what allows a good that's circulating as money to retain its value? Well, it can only come from, in my opinion, it can only come from three sources. It can come either intrinsically, which is what commodity money is. It can come through the people just decide, well, we're going to keep up with the convention of letting it circulate as a store of value, or the state tries to impose it from above. But without the store of value, it's not really acting as money. It's just it's
Yeah.
inherently unstable and probably inherently unsustainable if it
Yeah.
doesn't store value.
As you're talking about this, here's the problem about fiat currency as well. Even if the government was a good steward and they said we have in the Constitution, it's going to grow at a rate, let's say a couple percent, whatever it is, and it's going to hold
Yeah,
store of value. But the problem is, if the government loses a war, if the government doesn't exist anymore, the people that are holding that currency, it's worth nothing. And
yeah,
that's you're putting your trust in the government, and we don't know how long. So that's the kind of those who promote gold as money, I think, win that argument because even if you lose everything in your country and it doesn't exist anymore, they switch to another currency, whatever their case is, gold still holds a global value,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
you know what?
without a doubt.
I want to bring this up too. I got a denari I bought at the antique mall, which is kind of cool, and I think it's Marcus Aurelius on it. According
Good.
to AI, it's Marcus Aurelius. But when you look at this coin, it looks like it. I can't really tell, but just for our sake, let's say it's clipped. It's all silver, but it looks like it's clipped. And I think what people have to understand is back then, Rome had to keep on going to war constantly. And I think this is the number one thing with money you'll notice is war too, is
Yeah,
that they realized they don't have enough silver to pay the soldiers. So what they had to do is they took these coins, which was legal, and it has the face of the emperor on it, and they start clipping it, devaluing it, and hopefully people didn't realize. But I want you to really think about this: is that if you clip this coin, this one isn't worth as much as the previous coin, which means if
yeah,
I had older coins, they still held its value. It's just
yeah,
the new coins that are being minted are not worth anything. But think about fiat though. If I had a dollar bill in 1980, right, and I worked for it, well, it's worth a dollar, and now they're going to be printing dollars. It devalues the new currency. But what it does, this is the genius of fiat, the government to rip off the people. It devalues the current currency and the old currency, which the Romans couldn't do because if you had an old coin, it was still worth value,
yes.
right? They just
Oh,
devalued everything of what
mhm,
you own in US dollars
yeah,
instantly.
yeah,
And and in 1965, and I don't have it with me, I have all those. A quarter was, I think, 90% silver, right? In
yeah,
1965. That means in 1966, it had that copper inside it, but the 65 quarter still held its value.
yeah,
And it's worth right now in the antique mall. I'm trying to think how much I bought it for. $3, $4.
yeah,
I forgot, maybe six, something like
yeah,
that.
mhm,
But it's just interesting that fiat currency is an easier way to manipulate things that other currencies cannot do.
yeah. I to get to my students to understand this, what's happening with their money, as you just described it. I'm always looking for analogies that make things easier to understand. I'll say, okay, imagine for a minute that you own a home and you're living in it, and you have a regular shingle roof, and that each day the government, someone from the government comes and just takes a little bit of a shingle off your roof, just a little bit of one. And at first, and it happens every day, a little bit. And I thought, and when it first happens and you see what is missing, you might be like, well, okay, that's not going to affect anything. But I say, over time, what will happen? And they all say, well, yeah, the roof would start leaking. And of course, and I say, well, yeah, well, if they were doing that without your permission, would you put up with that? Would you let them come every day and take a little bit of your shingle away? And of course, they get indignant and say, no, that's terrible. And we can't do that. I said, well, that's what's happening with the money. Every day it's losing purchasing power because it's the way the fiat system works, just like you described a minute ago. And that's what's happening. And they're doing that day after day after day. And so, yes, over time, after 10 years, your roof will be gone, right? Or you'll
Yeah.
have, what is it? Since 1913, the purchasing power of money has lost, what, 97%.
Yeah.
So here we are, 100 years later, you've got 3% of your roof left. Well, you would have abandoned the house long before that, right? Or you would have stopped the process. So it's hard for people though to see it because it's money, it's unseen. right? And also we're propagandized into thinking that it's good for us. The system is good for us. Without it, we'd be lost. So,
Yeah, yes. So we kind of talked about Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas. So you would agree that Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas would pretty much agree with the legal definition of money, that it should come from the government, right?
yeah, I think so. I think that Aristotle understood that the three functions of money, and to St. Thomas, were the ones we've been talking about. St. Thomas understood that as well, but I think that they also understood money as the authority or the presence of money in the economy is dependent on the state giving its fiat and standing behind it. So yes, it would flow from the state.
And part of the reason too is because back then people could get a lot of fraud happen. You think you have gold, but it's not, or silver, and it took the sovereign to put their seal on it, so it
Yeah,
builds confidence in the economy, and then you feel good, and you say, you know what, I'm going to trade, because one thing people have to understand, you don't want to think about a third aspect. I want to think about my labor, your labor, we're
yeah,
trading, or my good, your good. Once you think about a third thing, it's gonna things could fail, the markets could collapse, and then especially if you believe there could be fraud, you don't. Or I always bring this up: if money is beautiful like gold,
hmm,
sometimes like what, I want what you have, I'm going to trade this, but that gold is too beautiful, therefore I don't want to trade it. And that could be a problem with gold. And I think you want money to be ugly in a way where you don't think about it. It's just an easy transaction. And that's where the economy would flow quicker, and you would have be definitely become more efficient in an economy. And then
yeah. That's it's an interesting thought, and eventually gold and silver most likely what would happen is surrogates, money surrogates would be what we exchange. Piece like checks and paper certificates that represent the gold that's on deposit. I don't know. Do you think it would be easier for someone to give up? I agree with you. You got a beautiful shiny gold coin or silver coin in your pocket, and you got to actually give it up to get what you want. That's difficult to do. But if that gold and silver was really on deposit at your bank, and what you had was a piece of paper that you exchanged with someone, and then they used that piece of paper to go get your gold, it
yeah.
might take away one element of that, you know, um, hesitation. But still, it would be much better to let people act as they wish rather than to coerce them into
and,
action.
and back and people don't realize when the second Bank of America failed from Andrew Jackson, we had the free banking era where if you go to the antique mall, you could find the Bank of Finley, the bank of tons of different banks, and they would issue their own currency, and people would trade that. And I want to get your thoughts on this real quick because it hit
Yeah,
me a couple years back. Is that each state would have its own currency, and you would have, especially early on, so you'd have Massachusetts, New York, and then the ones who managed it better held its value. That
yeah,
means the state next to this state, it's instead of having one currency, that it put more responsibility. You could hold responsible the leaders of New England, for example, because I believe it started dropping 14-1 compared to another currency. And hear this out and see what you think. Is that if we went back to that system where we had individual states, the principle of subsidiarity, which is a Catholic principle that local is better, would that not promote local trading more than going far away to another land? As in, if it's a currency that's local, it's easier to transact with you, my neighbor, rather than going to Utah or China, right? So the
hmm,
more that we have individual currencies, would that not promote subsidiarity?
oh yeah. No, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we're using theory and reason to arrive at that conclusion, but I think if we could find a way to observe it as well, there's no doubt we would do that. I mean, a lot of it. One of the ways that I always refer to it is, you know, we can either have a race to the bottom or a race to the top when it comes to monetary order. And a race to the bottom means when when the rules and regulations are such that you benefit by by devaluing the money, there's going to be a race to the bottom. But if there's competition and if there's local currencies circulating and people get to choose the currency that they want to deal in, like you just alluded to, then there'll be a race to the top, right? Then whoever's producing the currency will want their currency to be the one trusted the most, and that is what we should strive for. Is race to the top, because what we've had since for most of modern history is a race to the bottom. Ever since they allowed banks to falsify their certificates, so yeah, there was no doubt it would be much better to promote the local economy, and you know whether it even be at the state level or within the states,
And you could go,
into in the counties, in the
yeah.
U.S. by counties.
And you still could trade globally, just that if you have it'll be a transaction cost. There's a
Yeah,
cost to transact, which means it's only going to be certain situations, and it's easier just to do locally, which I think would be great.
yeah.
Oh,
I'm a few years older than you, Drew, I think, but I traveled in Europe when I was younger for work, and I was at markets all the time in Germany, in which the stands were all set up and the people were selling food, and you could basically use any currency there. I mean, this was before the euro, long before the euro. So if I wanted to go get a slice of pizza from a guy at a stand and who was Greek, and I said to him once, I don't have any. It was in Germany. I said, I don't have any Deutschmarks, but I have, French francs or Swiss francs or Italian lira, and they would say, that's okay. We'll take it all. We'll take any of the money, and they would obviously do their own exchange rate right there, and the exchange rate would always be not as much in your favor as it would be if you went to the bank or to the kiosk at the airport, but you were still dealing. The fact that there were different currencies did not hold up transactions or trade at the grassroots level. You know, those people selling the slices of pizza in the market would take any currency you had,
yeah.
and that would happen again naturally. In the U.S., if different states had different
And,
currencies, you'd be
and,
able to
and
spend it.
Michael, think about this. You walk into that pizza place, you see your neighbor in another or a different currency got to buy pizza pretty cheap, then you realize your leaders devalued your currency. Now you only could buy a half a slice. You would hold responsible would be your current leaders, which you have power over. I
Yeah,
have really limited power to hold any, so that the people in that area would hold those people responsible. And those people would have an incentive not to devalue their currency. And I think that's a great thing.
yeah, yeah. That's what we need to remember always is we have to hold our government accountable
But
for this. That's difficult to do.
but that's hard because the Congress in the Constitution has the right to coin and the weights of money, but they gave that up to the Fed.
Yeah,
So it's very hard to hold them responsible. And I think that's the way Congress likes it. Hey, it's not my fault. The Fed did it, right?
yeah,
Hey,
yeah,
I didn't do it.
yeah, yeah. Isn't that great? They get to hide behind it. They each get to hide behind each other.
And then also let's look at so we talked about Aquinas. I think Father Dennis Fahey pretty much takes up what Thomas Aquinas says,
Hmm.
and he would totally agree about that. It's the legal, it's the authority of the government should issue money, right?
Yeah, I think that, and I can't remember if Father Fahey. I've read almost all of his books. I can't remember if he said this explicitly or if it was just implicit in what he wrote, but he definitely would have advocated, in my opinion, that the money be issued by the sovereign state, that it
Yes.
not be that the state control the money, issue the money, interest free. Obviously, the state doesn't borrow the money into existence. It just simply issues it into existence. Um, and I think, Father Pesch, I know you're a big fan of Father Pesch also, like I am. I mean, a lot of his work is not available English, unfortunately, and his solidarism, which was striving to form a middle way between capitalism and collectivism, or individualism and collectivism, and that. And I don't think he wrote explicitly on money either, but would have probably also implicitly been characterized as advocating that the sovereign state be the issuer of the money. And at that point, it could be anything. Same with Father Fahey. It just can be token money. It doesn't have to be money that has any intrinsic value. So,
So, people know it's not dogma in the Catholic Church, but I would say the majority of those Catholic thinkers would agree with the sovereign must uh, create money, right?
I would think so too. Yeah. There's a real hesitancy among Catholics to form more libertarian positions when it comes to the role of government in the economy. So yeah, I would say that most Catholics come down on the sovereign issuance of the currency.
So I wanted to read this part in Quadragesimo Anno, if I'm pronouncing it right. It's paragraph 106. I love this part. It says, "This dictatorship is being most forcibly exercised by those who, since they hold the money," and he's talking about banks, "and completely control it, control credit also, and rule the lending of money. Hence, they regulate the flow, so to speak, of the lifeblood whereby the entire economic system lives, and have so firmly to their grasp the soul, as it were, of the economic life that no one can breathe against their will." Like, he's talking about banks creating credit, and how if they control that, they're controlling the lifeblood of. And we talked about the sovereign all this time. We have to understand, in 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act came out, it has to do with commercial banks, not the Federal Reserve. Commercial banks create money, and that's an important thing. And I also want to note, this is interesting. You go back to 1694, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve Act, the same year that the Federal Reserve Act happened, they did a constitutional amendment for the federal income tax. Because if banks
Yeah.
are going to lend to the government, there has to be a method where the government is going to pay back the bank with interest, which is you and I. And that's the same thing with the Bank of England. The majority of that document in 1694 had to do with taxes. It was
Mhm.
taxing everything so they can give money to the king to go all over the world, right? And it was the people that had to pay for it.
Yeah, that's great. And you're right. There's no coincidence that in the same year that the Federal Reserve Act was enacted, the federal income tax, the amendment that required an amendment to the Constitution, right? And by the
Yep.
way, the other uh, notorious change that happened that year was U.S. senators. The act, and I think
Yes.
this was a
Yes.
constitutional amendment as well, that senators are, since that year, 1913, are elected by popular vote in their states and not by the legislature. And
Yep.
that created another big problem. All three of those.
All the same time period, which is crazy. So people understand right now it's the popular vote. You wonder why it's so hard to vote out a senator. They go to DC, they kind of get, we all know this, they get corrupted in DC. But back then, what would happen is that if they win against the state right, if they win against states, they would have to um, answer to the legislators, which legislators could kick them out. So then we would be more authority. We have more power to go to our legislators, say, I don't like what that senator is doing. And therefore, it's more subsidiarity, which is a Catholic principle. And what we did after 1913 is centralized power. A lot of
Yeah.
centralized power,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Well, and the power behind those first two legislative movements, the Federal Reserve Act and the income tax, they knew it would be almost impossible to overturn those if they controlled the Senate, because it takes both the Senate and the House to overturn that, and so that's why that I don't think there is any coincidence that all three of those happen at the same time. I have a friend that he wants to start a movement called Cancel 1913.
I like it.
Yeah, cancel 1913. So cancel the Federal Reserve Act, cancel the income tax, and return the election of senators back to the state legislatures.
And I want to bring this note up. I think it was Murray Rothbard that brought this up, and there's a quote, and I'm paraphrasing. I had this in my presentation at the end, is that back in the day, if a king wanted to go to war, he would have to tax his citizens a certain amount of gold. If he went a little too high, there could be revolution, uprising, like people get very upset. And then they introduced debt in with the central banks. So what happened after debt was issued, you have longer wars and it killed a lot more people. And however, you still had to pay it back, which means they had to tax the people. But the most dangerous of them all, what he was saying is that now you have an inflationary tax, which we don't see it happen. So what they do is they issue it in debt and we don't know what's happening. And then prices go up and they're taking the value of everything we've done in the past to pay for what they've done. Right. And that's the most dangerous aspect. And we've seen the most deaths ever during this time period. Like, and the wars go on for a long time.
Yeah,
Wars would never last that long back then because you were
yeah,
limited to how much money you had.
yeah. Do you see how important it is to be able to teach this to students? You know, because the students that take my class, they learn these things exactly as you just laid it out. In fact, in Dr. Holtzman's book on that one chapter, he talks about the spiritual legacy of fiat inflation. That's one of his points is war. It makes war easier, longer, bloodier, and it's a double whammy. Not only do people lose their sons in the war, they lose their wealth, but it's all hidden and insidious. Some of the most famous quotes. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Wasn't it like Henry Ford that said, "It's a good thing the American people don't know how the banking system really works because if they did, there'd be a revolution tomorrow morning." You
Yeah.
know, isn't that his quote? And then another one was it's a British. I don't know if it's Lord Acton or I've got this. He said
Oh, was
the
he the was one of them the head of the Bank of England?
well, yeah, he has a famous quote, yeah, uh,
I remember that one.
about how the um, oh, I can't find it. It's something like the war that has to be fought is yet to be fought that will be is the war between the people and the bankers.
Um, I believe this story is interesting because Andrew Jackson is the one that killed the second Bank of America.
Uh,
And on his deathbed, they asked what was his greatest accomplishment, and he said, "I killed the bank." Like he hated the bank, which is
yeah,
really interesting hearing that story.
yeah. It's Lord Acton. I found Lord Acton said the issue which has swept down the centuries and will have to be fought sooner or later is the people versus the banks. Um, and yeah, and that quote that you mentioned alluded to about that was made by the former head of the Bank of England is a good, really damaging one as well.
And this one isn't for sure he said this, but it's attributed to him. But the spirit of it is true that Rothschild said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws."
Yeah,
Because the one who controls the money, which we saw Pope Pius the 12th, or was the 11th in
11th. Yeah,
Quadragesimo Anno, 11th, he said the same thing. Those who control it is controlling everything.
yeah,
And
yeah. And another one of my favorites, Drew, is Senator Lewis McFadden, who was chairman of the U.S. Banking Currency Commission for 22 years. He said the Federal Reserve banks are one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. And he would have known, I guess, right?
McFadden had a interesting, mysterious death.
Yeah,
He was very outspoken. People don't like back then. A lot of people were outspoken in the 1930s, 40s, and after World War II, it was pretty much squashed the debate
yeah,
about central banks. and you don't get a lot of people. I think you get more people talking about it now with the internet, and we could communicate much better.
Yeah.
Um, oh, so I want to kind of pivot here. I'm going to read a quote from the Fifth Lateran Council, the definition of usury. And I brought this up with Brian McCall, and I'm going to see your opinion on this. So I love this definition. So anybody knows usury is, want to know about it. Usury is the charging of interest on a loan. But it says that is the real meaning of usury when from its use, a thing, this is real important, which produces nothing is applied to the acquiring of gain and profit without any work, any expense, or any risk.
Mhm.
So what I brought up to Brian McCall was I used to be against, now I'm for Bitcoin, but,
Mhm.
and I wish I had it. I think this is in Father Fahey's work, and I did not bring it up with Brian McCall. I should have brought this up, that I believe it is Father Fahey, that he talked about if we take money that was meant for productive assets, true investments, which is for the common good, and we pull that money out and we invest in a thing that produces nothing and is applied to acquiring profit,
Mhm.
is that not a negative on society and usury? So this is my question is, if you want to use Bitcoin as a store of value and you truly believe that, I agree with that. And that's what I did. But if you're taking money away from true productive assets and you're taking it away and you're putting in a Bitcoin because you are speculating on the profit and you're going to make a gain without doing anything, is that not usury?
Sounds like it is, isn't it? Yeah, that covers a lot. That would cover a lot of activities. Um, and I know you might want to come back to Bitcoin. I've got a few other interesting things to say about that eventually. But I mean, when you read that statement and then you think about it, I mean, think of the problems this creates with investing in, financial securities today, particularly stocks. All right, if you buy a stock in Apple, or let's say you go buy 1,000 shares of stock in Apple today, you're not investing in Apple. You you end up purchasing a claim on Apple, but you don't invest in Apple. They're not
Your
getting
mo-
your money.
yeah, your money did not go to Apple. It went to Joe, who owned that stock before you.
Right. It went to the seller, and you're hoping to gain from it. Now, there is risk. So, the people who want to argue that, well, there's risk involved, but you're not sharing risk with Apple. Well, you are maybe in a way you're sharing risk with Apple, but there's definitely no work involved, and your money is not going to a productive use for sure because it's going to the seller. I mean, you have no control what the seller's doing it. In other words, you're buying stock. It's a little bit like gambling, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
you can go lay a bet on the Kansas City Chiefs winning the Super Bowl again next year, and that's a bet. That's a gamble. You're taking a risk, but it's totally there's no work involved. The Chiefs have to do all the work. It's just totally for gain, nothing else.
You know, I brought this up when I'm sitting in with my Catholic friends. I'd bring this stuff up. It kind of gets interested on people are really interested. Other people get very angry at me when I bring this up. But the stock question, you are 100% correct. And I have to make sure we understand risk in the, and I think we talked about this, Brian McCall. Risk, what it means, what they mean by risk is that I invest in a project and we're risking the profits that if they make a lot of money on profits, I'm going to get 30%, you're getting 70. So you're the labor, I'm the capital, right?
Yeah.
That's what risk is, not necessarily, well, you know what? The world could blow up tomorrow. Therefore, if I give a loan, that's going to be risky. That's not the same kind of risk.
Yeah.
And um, and we have to understand that there's no work involved. 100% correct. You're not even giving Apple money. Now, it indirectly kind of helps them that if they issue new stock, they could say, well, it drove the price of the stock up. And now but that's an indirect. None of the money goes to Apple. And expense in this isn't Expense, I bought the stock. Expenses, I lent money out and I had to hire a soldier to grab the money. Therefore, you're going to pay for that. That's
Yeah.
expense. Or I had to
Yeah.
have someone do the paperwork. Or expense would
Yeah.
be I bought a stock and it cost me $5 to purchase the stock, which is free today, but back in the day it was $12.99 for E-Trade. That would be an expense, right?
Yeah.
And I would agree. That is, I mean, when you look at that definition, we have to get, I think we have to get from a society away from easy money. And we got to get back to, because Christ redeemed labor, right? He redeemed it, that it was negatively looked upon by the Greeks and the Romans. The slaves did labor,
Mhm.
and he redeemed it, that it's a good. And we should think about how we're going to make money with our hands, or actually do work, rather than I'm going to buy something, sit back, and hopefully it goes up, right?
Yeah. Just think of, your, if you add to this your thoughts earlier that we talked about on subsidiarity and, helping the local community. If all the money, all the surplus savings from people that is currently going into buying stock in Apple and Amazon through intermediaries that take a fee for it, and mainly through mutual funds, which take a fee for it as well. If that money was actually really going into local investment in local businesses and local, forms of productive activity, just think of the effect that would have on the local economy. In other words, instead of using your savings to purchase financial stocks, in companies that you have no control over, if instead you were investing, your money was being used to invest locally in businesses that were producing food, clothing, shelter, other products that people wanted and needed in the local economy, it would transform society. I think that was the solidarism, the idea behind solidarism that Father Pesch promoted in the first quarter of the 20th century. That sort of thing. That notion of local concentration of that type of capital and activity would
So,
transform culture.
and people got to realize too is that when you're investing in these companies, these are globalist companies that most Catholics would disagree with. Like, we
Yeah.
should disagree with these global companies, and that's where the money goes into. So if we have a 401k, you only are given a certain amount of companies or funds that you can invest in, and you're not really. Again, it's that concept. I want that money to double. I want it to triple, quadruple over time without any work, expense, or risk.
Hmm.
And I would argue there's really no risk, because I mean you have some downturns, but if you look the last 100 years, it's pretty much, even during downturns, you look at the graph, it's going down, and then after a couple of years, it's like nothing happened. It went back to where it was, and it's going up.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I mean, I'm sure you probably teach classes on investments, and I do. We teach portfolio management theories and all those things. But it's clear to me, and I usually give the students the opportunity to read other approaches to this question, like we're talking about here. To use your savings to invest in the local economy, to actually, you know, uh, you're not investing solely to gain or to profit, but there's work involved, there's labor, there's sharing of risk, and then the reward is also shared. There's that is, I think, the, the Catholic way. That's the way of subsidiarity. It's the way of solidarity, uh, in my opinion. But that, like you said, that doesn't win you many friends from people who
no,
are
it
just
doesn't. Um,
okay.
and if there's any politicians watching this, this is uh, a Drew Blazsik thing I think we should do, is that we need to change the IRS code for 401k company match. And we should be able to have pre-tax company match money and invest in locally. If you want to redo a home, if you want to pay off your home So you're not in a 30-year mortgage. You could pay it off within 10 years, and then you can use that money for other investments. We should be able not just to do global companies. We should use that money and we can invest in local businesses as we see and not
Yeah,
so controlled. And that's not really difficult. I looked into it. The IRS just has to change one of their codes on that, but it has to do with
yeah,
the companies. I think there is a way you could do that now, but it's just more work for the company, so they stay away from it. But
yeah. Yeah, well, they got the Roth IRA passed. That was a great thing, I thought. They could get something like you just proposed passed if to the people, but it takes courage and it takes ability to face certain uncomfortable truths. Um, and the finance industry is the most powerful one right now, banking and finance, and they're making all the fees through the 401k, the IRA, and the mutual fund system. In the secondary market, they're just making all the fees.
I'm looking them up. I don't know if you know the name who created the 401k. I think it was in 1977.
Mhm.
70, let me see. Ted Benna. He's considered the father of 401k. And I'm just going to, 1978. And I heard this. I tried to find his quote. I could not find it, but I found it on a podcast. He said this. So take it for a grain of salt. That he said he regrets what he did because what it did, it destroyed the family. For back then, when your parents are growing older, the kids would take care of the parents. A lot of times they would move in. And the 401k, now we think we are a burden on our kids. So we want to invest, invest, invest. And think about it, we die with $1 million, right? We
Mhm.
die, and then our 401k gets distributed to our kids when we could have used that money from the beginning when our kids were young and create a business, maybe a dumpy house you buy, you renovate it, you make it livable. But I remember him saying in a podcast, he said this, and these guys are pretty trustworthy people, so I assume he said it. He regretted it because it destroyed the family.
Yeah, and it destroyed pensions. Companies with defined guaranteed benefit pensions, because now it
Yeah.
shifted it away from the company committing to supporting the worker that stayed with them for 30 or 40 years once they retired, and it put it all on the employee. Now you have to invest in this 401k, and it's always portrayed as being a great thing for us. This is much better for us to be able to take our money rather than rely on the company to invest it for us and guarantee us a pension when we retire. We're going to take it and invest it ourselves. But obviously we have to invest it through what the company tells us, through the 401k manager and the mutual funds that the 401k manager chooses for us. So yeah, I'm not surprised that guy felt that way. I mean, that there's been a lot of changes that were never explained to us, that this is what's going to happen. In,
And
in
I'm sure you know this that when you invest in these funds, let's say BlackRock, because if you look at every American company, big company, it's controlled by BlackRock, Street. I'm trying to think of the name. Street
State
something and
Street,
Vanguard.
States,
State Street
States.
and Vanguard. They're always one, two, and three. You
Yeah,
sign your rights over as a voter for that company, which
yeah,
means BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard has voting rights. And you
yeah,
wonder why global companies go the same direction always is because all the money is getting managed by BlackRock, but they have voting rights.
yeah.
And it doesn't always happen that way. I know sometimes you might see some voting rights come in on certain funds, but the majority of the time, that's how they have so much control. And you notice how all the companies do the same thing. Like it doesn't make sense. It's such a new concept came out, and they're all agreeing to it. It's because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing, it's a great point. The other thing that people don't realize is that when you don't own stock in Apple and Amazon, you have a claim on a mutual fund, and the mutual fund itself owns Apple, and the mutual fund can give you a printout. that says, you have $10,000 invested with us, and that $10,000 is invested in these companies, and you can read that, 2% in Apple, 3% in Amazon, whatever it is. But so your claim is on the mutual fund. It's not on the stock, right? And uh, so it even removes by another one more iteration the connection between you and the company, which again speaks in favor of that quote that you read earlier from the Lateran Council, that there's not any work involved. There's no nexus between the money that you used to purchase the claim and where it's going, and the company that you're supposedly invested in. There's no nexus any longer.
Yeah. So I think I got one last part. We'll talk about these plans, but I want to ask you this question that asked um, Brian McCall, is that in the back, so in Europe, or back then when usury was absolutely forbidden, is that the lender was the sin of usury, and a lot of times the borrower wasn't considered guilty of the sin. And back then, it majority of the time had to do with because they needed food or pay taxes. It was an emergency. Not too many people got dead. In our society, the lender is an institution, and the borrower, like us, we're individuals. So the institution's like a usurious system that's going on, that in our day and age, we borrow money all the time. So we're borrowing for our car, our house, our goods. We see that nice new computer, we put it on a credit card constantly. I like to make the argument, because it's materialism, these aren't things I have to have, like a food, I have to pay taxes or go to jail, is that isn't the borrower, could be argued, committing the sin of usury?
Yeah, I remember I watched with great interest when you and Brian were discussing this, and it came up. I may have mentioned to you when we were talking offline that Brian, very generous. He speaks to my class every year when we're done reading his book in the spring on usury. And this came up this year, was this same topic of whether the borrower uh, is complicit at all in the sin of usury. And Brian said the same thing at that time as he said on your show. But I think I lean more towards what it sounds to me like you think as well, and that is, I do think in today's world, if you're borrowing out of necessity, then you're a victim, and or if you're borrowing uh, not just out of necessity, but if you have been misled, like if you're the you could be the victim of fraudulent representation. But many of the things that we borrow for, are not necessities, and so we're enabling the system. Now it can be argued, well, and I use this argument sometimes. The system itself is like water to a fish, right? You can't ask a fish to exist outside of water, and you can't ask any of us to exist outside of the current monetary system that we operate in, which is institutionalized usury, to use the famous phrase Father Dempsey wrote in his work in 1945, that usury has become institutionalized. It's systemic now. It's removed the nexus between the usury, the sin, and the individual on the part of the lender. Um, but despite all those caveats, I still think that there's an argument to be made that the borrower can be complicit in the act, because they're borrowing, they're enabling a usurious system to function and to thrive through their activity.
Yeah,
You
I
know what
think
I
a
mean?
good example, and I think a good example of this would be that you have to get to work. Your car broke down, and you need a car, and you don't have all the money in the world You don't have big savings. Well, you have to get a car. You have to get a car. That would be justifiable, right? You have to get to work. But then it goes into the other area where, you know what, I want to get that speedboat. I want to get this. Or the average car in 2019 was 32,000. And now the price, not because car prices went up, but the average price of a new car or sold new car is over 50,000. It's because people's taste, they want more. And I think, yes, you need that car, but then you're getting, you know what? I can go in debt and I could stretch this out to 10 years now or 8 years, and I don't even notice the payments. And I'm gonna live like a king, right? And I think what that does, it creates immediacy, and we're not thinking of eternal things. We're thinking of, I want it easy before the work, right? It's like investing in Apple. I want to buy Apple without any work expense or anything. I want it now before the work. And I think
Mhm.
if we worked first and then purchased things, we would think more as a spiritual level, eternal things, and we would think more uh, aspects of, you know what, I want more children. I want to do what's hard today because that's better into the future, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure you know, like I do, people who do live their lives debt free. They do operate with that type of frugality, or they live within their means. They save. They purchase items that they can afford, only the items that they can afford. In other words, they don't participate in the system at all. And we all know people like that. It's certainly possible. Now Brian would McCall would say, in fairness, that these people might be guilty of the sin of imprudence, but they're not guilty of a sin of usury. And I think, in that sense, I do think he's thinking like a good lawyer. He's using the narrow definition of usury as the charging of interest. So the only one who's guilty of usury is the one who could charge interest. The one who is charged might be a victim, or might be imprudent, but they're not guilty of usury. Whereas I think what you and I are arguing is usury in the broad sense, and that's the existence of the usurious system. And in that use of the term usury, then in my opinion, there's no question that the borrowers are complicit in the sin of the system. Because if people stopped borrowing money, the system would dry up, wouldn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
the government could continue to borrow, but if the
And like I
private
mentioned
sector.
earlier, the system creates the borrowing, because what happens is that you look at this new Honda Accord that you can buy for, let's say, $30,000, and you're like, well, if it's going to be 30,000 4 years from now, that gives me an incentive. I'm going to save. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to pay cash for that car, right? I'm going to save and do that. But if that car is going to, because the dollar is devaluing, because the dollars are being printed, and that car could cost 44,000, I need to buy it today because prices are always going up. And I think that pushes people, it hurts savers, and it pushes people, you have to go in debt today, because I don't think people realize this, but with businesses, what's his name? Michael Saylor, if you are familiar with him, he has a 2 hour podcast where he talks about accounting practices, that businesses hate holding on to dollars because they lose value every year, and they have to show they're making money on their investments, and it makes more sense for companies to go in debt. Like Apple has so much money and they have tons of debt, and
Yeah,
they get rid of dollars for that purpose,
yeah.
and it causes chaos. It causes risky behavior with businesses and individuals, because we're always playing that game. I have to keep what I earned and try to make a profit so it's the same value it is in the future, or I have to purchase today and I need to go into debt.
Yeah, absolutely. And another economist that is really good on that point is Michael Hudson. I mentioned his name earlier. I mean, he's not, in my opinion, not good on everything, but he's very good on that. He even uses Apple, like you just did. The example, Apple generates mountains of cash. They don't need to borrow any money. Why are they, issuing $1 billion bond issues every couple of years, and it's because the system is incentivizing them to that. And the second point is when you're talking about, the way what it means for individuals today, particularly young people. The great term I've heard used on this, again, I credit Dr. Guido Hulsmann. He calls it the rationality trap. Where young people are trapped into they know rationally, they know that they shouldn't go into debt. Nobody, no grandparent advises their grandkids to go into debt. That's not good advice. But on the other hand, rationally, they have to. And in fact, because money loses purchasing power, you're actually much better off going into debt to buy a house that will increase in value while you're paying off the debt with ever decreasing valuable money. And so it's a trap. The rational thing to do now is what would otherwise be irrational, but for the system that we're trapped in. So, students, once they start, the young people that, at least by my experience in my classes, once they start understanding, you can imagine the light bulbs that go on in some of the classes and the class discussions and
Yes.
things, and they come up and talk to me after class, and they start realizing this. And it's really good. I mean, that's the one benefit that you and I can have as teachers, is that we can, no, we can't change the system, but we can affect people's knowledge and understanding of it, so that they can make decisions and take action that is helpful to them in the long run, and not maybe necessarily easy or rational in the current system. And so we have to continue to promote this and to educate, particularly the young people on this.
And remember that the government does promote debt, as in businesses, you get tax benefits if you go into debt on interest payments, right?
Yeah.
And then also, if there's a bankruptcy that's declared, the number one who has rights to the assets of the company are the debt holders, not the equity holders. And that's designed purposely to
Yeah.
promote debt.
Yeah, I'm sure you mentioned that in class. I do every semester when I teach principles of finance. Yeah, it's like, why does debt have a lower risk premium on it than equity for the investor? Why is debt, the return on debt is always lower than the return on equity? Why? Well, it's lower in risk. Why? Well, because it has a preferred position. Like you just said, if if the investment goes bad, the creditors get paid in full before the equity holders get anything. So
Yes.
yes, there's an incentive for sure.
Okay, Michael, I'm gonna promote something and convince you that the Chicago plan is the way to go. Uh, so this is a monetary system that was promoted in after the Fed, especially in the 1930s. I'm going to read this. Two University of Chicago economists, Henry Simons and Paul Douglas, created what was called the Chicago Plan, which proposed monetary reform to the U.S. out of the Great Depression. The chancellor of the university, Maynard Hutchins, saw that as Chicago Plan was formulated in legal detail and introduced into the U.S. Congress as potential legislation. The two main features of this plan, and this is what I promoted too, one of these was the U.S. government would nationalize essentially the private Federal Reserve System. So now it's public, that it's not a private system, and it's 12 federal branches. Second, the fractional reserve accounting system of all the nation's member banks would be ended. Banks would no longer create what the nation used for money when making loans. Government money, not bank debt, would be used, and it'd be 100% reserve. And I'm going to get this one quote. This is by Simons. He said, "The mistake lies in fearing money and trusting debt." I love that quote.
Yeah, so you want to convince me? Well, in fact, I may be wrong on this. Didn't Milton Friedman at one point in his career come out
Yeah,
in favor of something almost exactly like this? as well.
He promoted it, and I think it's that classic after World War II kind of stuff in the
Hmm.
60s, 70s that he might have went to some other rationale. Um,
Yeah. Well,
here's
it's
one interesting. What's that?
I was going to say it's appealing. What's appealing about it is, the 100% reserve requirement. So the banking would at that point be prevented from creating any money at all. The idea that it would be enshrined in law that the money supply will increase by a certain percent every year. I think Friedman was an advocate of 3%. All right, the money supply is going to increase by 3% a year, no matter what, every year, year after year after year, and so those are appealing. I mean, I would probably say it would be better than what we have now. But that's not saying a whole lot because what we have now is not it's not any good at all. There's probably nothing redeeming about what we have now. So it'd be better than what we have now. So,
So one version was sent to all the U.S. academic economists, about 1,000 in total. Of those responding, 235 from 157 universities agreed with the proposal. Another 40 approved it with reservations, and only 45 disapproved. This
mhm.
got massive support in the day that you don't see today. I want to read this too. This is interesting. This was by late Congressman Wright Patman, chairman of the United States House Committee on Banking and Currency for over 16 years. He said, quote, I have never yet had anyone who could, through the use of logic and reason, justify the federal government borrowing the use of its own money. I believe the time will come when people will demand that this be changed. I believe the time will come in this country when they will actually blame you and me and everyone else connected with the Congress for sitting idly by and permitting such an idiotic system to continue. And
Yeah,
because
that's a great quote. You'll have to
the
send me that. I'd never heard that before. Yes,
I'll
great.
send it to you right now. The Congress has the authority. They have the authority and are given the authority in the Constitution, and they gave it up for private commercial banks, which the Federal Reserve, I know you want, some people say, part private, part, it's a private entity as we cannot audit it, and it's owned by private banks. If you look at it, and they pay these private shareholders 6% every year.
Hmm.
You're talking about usury right there, right?
Yeah,
Guaranteed 6%.
yeah,
It's in the system, and the people who control the Federal Reserve are the same people that were in the commercial banks. It's just a continuous. They just appoint this J.P. Morgan, whoever, and they just put people in there. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. But
yeah. And the people who control the central banks also control the government. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. I sometimes, in my opinion, the argument as to whether the Fed is privately owned or part private, part public, or the Austrian school, many of the Austrian advocates are fond of portraying the Fed as really the government. The government and the Fed are the same thing, that's probably true, but not because the Fed is government owned, but because the owners of both the Fed and the government are the same people. You know, um, so ab- absolutely. I mean, I don't think we need a central bank at all. I mean, that's the one part about the Chicago plan that I would disagree with, and that is it should be. There's no need for a central bank. If there's a 100% reserve requirement on commercial banks, why do you need central banking? I mean, the states can handle it. You
I
know,
think if anyone wants to listen, look up Michael Kumhoff. He did a paper with Benz in 2012. He does a bunch of lectures online. He said the central bank would be transformed. They're not unemployment and price control. They're just it's a different central bank managing and with the other local banks.
yeah.
So it is a bit different. But anyone
So it'd
wants
be
to
a
look into it,
true. Would they want it to be like a lender of last resort in case a bank got in trouble?
but I know
Um,
central bank wouldn't do that. It would be the Treasury which would issue new money each year. So it'd be the
yeah.
U.S. government, and the Treasury would. But Now, I read very basic. That paper, I read some of it. It's beyond academic. Like it's not an easy read. But he
Mhm.
goes into numbers and they did a model. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Last thing, unless you have any other thoughts about Chicago Plan.
No, other than I was going to mention, I know that you and I talked about this also that, the a more radical version of the Chicago plan is gaining traction now called modern monetary theory, which is MMT. And interesting, they're the biggest proponents of the credit theory on the origin of money currently. But modern monetary theory would advocate the same thing: is that to take the money creation power away from the banking system and put it in the hands of the Treasury, controlled by the federal government. But I think, as you mentioned when we talked about this, unlike the Chicago plan, which would enshrine in law what the percent increases of the money supply would be, uh, MMT advocates leave that up to the government, right?
So
Give them
MMT
flexibility.
could be very dangerous. So the Federal Reserve does not create money as commercial banks, and the MMT would eliminate that, as in the government could just print at will, which means if they want to give a bunch of money to whoever, they can easily do that. And it could be very dangerous. So a lot of progressives like that because they want to give money to certain groups. It would make it very easy. The Chicago plan, they could not do that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and there's no constraints on their issue of money. Yeah, absolutely. I see that. I mean, they're gaining that movement has gained quite a bit of traction. Believe it or not, modern monetary theory. I think because of that.
and in that paper I talked about with Zarlinga, he has a whole section on MMT, and he talks about to try to connect it, it's erroneous, and it's a really bad system.
Yeah.
Last, I want to bring this up. If you're familiar with Social Credit by C.H. Douglas,
Hmm.
he was a British engineer and economist, developed the social credit theory in the early 20th century. And this is what he brought up. There's a website that goes in on it. It says the gap between, and this makes sense, production and purchasing power. Douglas argued that the total wages and salaries paid to consumers are always less than the total prices of goods produced, creating a chronic shortfall in demand. Now, think about that. Is that wage now we say spending and wages should equal, right, in our economic
Yeah.
theory, but he's saying he noticed this as an engineer that price is always higher than what wages are. Therefore, if we're getting paid money to buy the prices, the goods, there's not enough money to purchase all the prices. Therefore, that's why you have companies that collapse, a lot of things happen in the economy, which is interesting. So he said they need to create that gap, the government, and it hands out as dividends to all U.S. citizens, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I mean the two questions that I would have on that, and I'm not as familiar with that proposal. It's interesting that a lot of these that we've been talking about, like the Chicago Plan, social credit, even Father Pesch, um, these these were all ideas that were discussed in the early 20th century, right? In the first quarter of the 1900s, right, from 1900 to the 1930s and up until World War II. It's interesting. This was a time of apparently tremendous uh, discussion and debate on all these things. So the two questions on social credit of C.H. Lawrence would be: first of all, is he identifying a monetary problem or a different problem? Because to solve it by issuing money implies that it's a monetary problem. There's because that's what the solution is. It's a monetary solution. And second would be, and this applies to a lot of things, is, who is monitoring the data on this that then makes decisions? I mean, when we say prices exceed wages, how do we know that? I mean, does the price, on the border, do prices on the border between Michigan and Ohio exceed wages in the same way that the prices exceed wages in Atchison, Kansas? I mean, in other words, are we talking about a blanket system across a huge country like the United States? How are we? What methodology would they propose using, to implement the system, and who gets to decide, on how, on what action to take? I mean, it's all, that's always a problem in any political policy.
Yeah, it's so there's a party in Canada called the Alberta Social Credit Party, won a
Yeah.
surprise victory in 1935, and they actually adopted that. And I heard uh this was a while back when I heard a podcast on it that the banks did not like that was adopted in the area because they believe the same as the Chicago plan that it should be controlled by the government. So they went hardcore and invested a lot of money to get these people kicked out of office. After they implemented that, I mean, the banks went at it and they lost eventually, and then it got overturned, the monetary system.
Yeah.
Oh, and Japan asked for C.H. Douglas to come down to Japan, if I remember correctly, and they were looking to adopt it as well back then. And again, after World War II, all debates shut down, which is so this was not just some fringe idea. And there's a website that talks about it, and he said the problem with the Chicago plan, it does not answer the problem of prices and wages, which is interesting. And I
Yeah.
got to look more into it about it. But there is a website if you got anyone wants to search it. Um, it's called the Social Credit Douglas, C.H. Douglas. See if I can have it brought up. DouglasSocialCredit.com, I think what it is.
Oh, really?
And there's some gentleman. I don't know if this is it. Well, I'll put in the show notes once I find what that is, what the website is. There's a PhD that runs it. Maybe I should try to interview him sometime and talk more about
Yeah.
it. But there's a lot of math behind it, and they talk about it. So it is interesting. It carried a. It was not a fringe thing. It was something that a lot of people are looking into.
Yeah.
And
Now, I see it. I just went to the website. I see it. It's DouglasSocialCredit.com.
oh, I think
Yeah.
it's socred.org. Yeah, that's it. Socred, CRED.org.
SOCRED.org. Yeah, that's another Clifford Hugh Douglas Institute.
So this
Is that based
there's a
in?
lot of articles you could read about it in that one.
Yeah.
And again, I'll put that in the show notes.
I mean, it's interesting when you read any reading that you do on this from a Catholic perspective, where you're reading, Catholic authors or a book that's not just totally hostile to the Catholic position. And then you realize between Father Pesch, Father Fahey, Father Coughlin, Father Cahill, Father Dempsey, and then non-Catholics. I'm guessing Douglas is probably not Catholic, but maybe Christian. And you get these other things. There are a lot of innovative ideas. That, some of the criticisms that come from other Catholics are more technical. Like, this is more of an ideal. This wouldn't work practically in the practical system. We couldn't. How do we monitor the data? Who gets to decide for whom, and things like that. So it's not that the intent is off base, or that the ideal is incorrect. The question is whether practically the system is possible. It's the same thing with what's the famous movement from Belloc and Chesterton. Um,
Oh, uh,
yeah,
can't think of
I'm
it.
having.
But go on, I'll look it up.
Yeah, it's the land movement.
Distributism.
Distributism. Yeah.
Distributism.
Yeah, so these are good. These are all interesting ideas and deserve to be, reviewed and investigated and explored and considered. and all that. I mean, that's my position on everything. I want to hear more about it and consider it, but how practical they are on a technical application side would be the big question. Again, I'm not trying to throw water on any of them. I'm just saying that realistically, that's the other question that has to be explored.
Yeah, I'm just kind of reading up on it, and he talks like this is really interesting. And I remember the guy who created the website said that's not the reason why they're against usury, but it talks about the gap. It has many causes, which is including profits derived from interest charges, the reinvestment of savings, deflationary banking policy. But it talks about with that gap, it's causing more debt because of that gap to fulfill those price gaps, and then it's more interest that's not going to the productive economy.
Yeah,
But I remember it kind of fulfills that we're talking about with usury. A lot of these principles will help to solve the issue on that. But he was an Anglican, so
okay,
uh, and he noticed that as an engineer in the I forgot when it was, like early 1900s, and they came up with this
yeah.
idea.
It's an important question is whether does the economy function like a machine, that you can tweak here, you can tweak there, or is it an organic, because it's made up of humans acting and choosing and whatnot, that it's hard to control it or to implement a policy as if it were a machine. And
Yeah,
I think like the advocates of the Austrian School of Economics would argue in favor of it's not a machine. Economics is a social science. It's got acting human beings, and some of these proposals that seem ideal are just impractical. They can't actually be implemented like that. But
yeah,
good ideas to debate and to keep
I
in the
agree.
discussion. So
I think we need to bring back the ideas of the 20s of a lot of these monetary things and bring it back to the debate with politicians, because that was debated a lot back then. And
yeah,
again, no one debates it today. Maybe the only comments you get from Rand Paul about we need to audit the Fed. I mean, not too much. Uh, you just don't get a lot of
yeah,
what's the name? Vivek Ramaswamy kind of brought up a couple things about the
yeah,
Fed. He was the first politician run for president, so I was kind of excited about that. But again,
yeah,
if they get elected, more than likely they won't touch it unless there's a lot of
yeah.
support, grassroots support on this.
I agree. There's no discussion of this on any important level, with very few exceptions. So
Yeah,
that's why the students in my class, they love it. They just really take to this because they're not getting it anywhere else, and they want to know. So we have to continue to get the word out.
yeah. Well, Michael, any last words? This is a great podcast, 2 hours and 15 minutes.
Oh
A lot of
yeah,
fun.
great.
Any
Oh,
last words you want to convince the audience?
well, I mean, I would say number one, the monetary system that we have currently is not only, and we should choose our words carefully and not and refrain from hyperbole if possible. But I don't think it's hyperbole to say the current monetary system we operate under is evil. Okay, and that's a word. It lacks any good. It's evil. It's definitely unsustainable. I think what we're witnessing is the death throes of the current system. And the only question is what will emerge next. Will it be even more evil, like central bank digital currency, CBDC, or do we have a chance to reform it back to something that's less evil, or God willing, even good for the Commonwealth? But the system that we have now is unsustainable. And whether your issue of passion is, Catholic social teaching to restore Christian order in society, Catholic order to, restore subsidiarity, um, whatever your social issue of passion is, I believe that those reforms ultimately will run up against the rocks unless the monetary system is reformed. We have to get back to it. We have to return to monetary order. And what that order is subject to discussion and debate. And I have some opinions, and you do as well, and other good people. Brian McCall does. There's good people in this. Guido Hulsmann, Richard Werner, for anybody who wants to read up on some of these spokesmen that are talking about this. It has to be reformed. We have no choice. Now, will we be swept up in the next reform into something worse, like central bank digital currency? I don't know. We have to hope and pray that the reform results in something better, because I think reform is coming. The fiat dollar debt-based currency system is getting ready to collapse. And whether it collapses in total, disorganization and chaos, or in some, controlled way, controlled demolition, we don't know that either. We have to hope for, calm, controlled reform. But those are my thoughts. So for your viewers who are interested in this topic, that is the single. You and I talked about this, Drew. Father Fahey, brilliantly, in my opinion, when he lists the 7, pillars of Christian divine organization of society, one of them is monetary order, which is really unheard of almost from theologians. To focus on something as mundane and practical as monetary order. That's almost the foundation of the rest of social order. And we need a return to monetary order and monetary sanity. That's my closing rant.
I think you're 100% correct. I mean, it's the lifeblood of the economy. And if you think about the economy, it gives the ability for the father to fulfill his duties, rights and duties for his family. Like, it's so
Absolutely.
important. It's not just, I want to make a bunch of money. It's to take care of the family, and money is the lifeblood of it. And just like Quadradiso Anno has talked about that, it's so important for that.
Yeah, if you follow Father Fahey's steps from the bottom upward, and I know we didn't really get into Father Fahey as much, but I know you're a fan of his, as am I. Monetary order, private property, marriage, education. The church's role. The church has priority on the social order, and then the church and state. Monetary order at the bottom, and it climbs up, and marriage and the family is in there. Education is in there. So the monetary order affects all of that. The dad's ability to fulfill his role, the mom's ability to fulfill her role, the extension of the family from grandchildren to grandparents, the support of family members, it's all tied in together. And we have to restore economic order. Absolutely.
I agree. Well, hey, well, appreciate it, Michael. Appreciate it coming on. Maybe if another topic comes up, we got to do this again. Break down some specific ones. I think that'd be a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun. I could talk about this for hours.
I would too. Yeah.
And yeah, this is Drew Blazsik, Logos and Markets, and it's Dr. Michael King with us, and Lost to be Christy.